Have you ever wondered what happens when an elite fighting force walks into a trap designed to annihilate them and refuses to die? What it takes to turn a perfectly planned ambush into a lesson in why Marines earn their reputation? What happens when numerical superiority, tactical advantage, and total surprise meet men who've been trained since boot camp to believe that surrender isn't in their vocabulary? Lance Corporal Jimmy Donovan, just 20 years old from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, felt the humidity clinging to his skin like a second layer of clothes. March in the Vietnamese jungle meant sweat that never dried, leeches that found their way through every gap in your uniform, and the constant metallic taste of fear mixed with salt tablets. He'd been in country for 7 months with the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the unit everyone called the Walking Dead, and the nickname felt less like dark humor every day. In his pocket, wrapped in plastic against the jungle rot, he carried a letter from his girl back home, Teresa. She'd asked him what Pittsburgh looked like from where he was standing. He'd never found the words to answer that question. How do you explain to someone safe at home that here doesn't resemble anything they'd recognize as a world? If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about the men who executed those missions under impossible conditions. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes.
March 17, 1968. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, forever known as the Walking Dead for their catastrophic casualties during earlier operations, moved through triple canopy jungle 5 clicks south of the DMZ. This wasn't reconnaissance. This was deliberate provocation. Operation Lancaster II had one clear objective: find NVA regulars and force engagement. Intelligence suggested a regiment-sized enemy force was operating in the area, but intelligence reports in I Corps rarely captured the full picture. Lance Corporal Jimmy Donovan walked point for 2nd Platoon, Alpha Company. The humidity made his flak jacket feel like it weighed 50 pounds instead of 20. Every step through the elephant grass required deliberate thought. Ankle turned the wrong way could mean a punji stake. A misplaced boot could trigger a buried Chicom grenade. Behind him, 19 other Marines spread out in a tactical column, moving with the cautious precision of men who'd learned that the jungle itself was weaponized. The tactical situation was straightforward on paper. Operation Lancaster II aimed to interdict NVA infiltration routes south of the DMZ. Intelligence suggested light enemy presence, scattered patrols, supply caches, nothing a reinforced platoon couldn't handle. The brass in Da Nang wanted pressure maintained on enemy logistics. 1st Battalion, 9th Marines would provide that pressure. Simple, routine. At least that's what the maps and briefings suggested. On the other side of that same jungle, Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thieu stood in a camouflaged command bunker, studying a sand table model of the terrain his men had spent 3 weeks preparing. Thieu, 31 years old, had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu as a teenager. He'd survived a decade of jungle warfare while most American Marines were still in high school. His men called him Uncle, not from affection, but from respect, the kind earned through competence and shared suffering. He'd positioned his 2nd Battalion, 812th Regiment with methodical precision, interlocking fields of fire, spider holes dug into the hillsides, fallback positions prepared in layers. The Americans would walk into a killing zone designed by someone who understood their tactics as well as they did. They weren't wrong to believe victory was assured. Every advantage, terrain, numbers, preparation, belonged to them. But confidence, no matter how well founded, doesn't account for the variable that defies calculation: the capacity of trapped men to fight with a ferocity that transcends training. Lance Corporal Jimmy Donovan felt the weight of the PRC-25 radio on his back as he moved through the elephant grass, sweat already soaking through his flak jacket despite the early morning cool. 20 years old, from Pittsburgh's north side, He'd joined the Marines because his father had been a Marine and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Donovans had worn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. The photograph in his wallet, Sarah smiling in front of the Monongahela River, her letter tucked beside it promising to wait, felt like it belonged to someone else's life. That was the person he'd been 8 months ago. The jungle had a way of making everything before Vietnam seem like a half-remembered dream. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, call sign the Walking Dead, a nickname earned through casualty rates that would have broken lesser units, had been operating in the Arizona Territory for 6 days. Search and destroy, find the enemy, engage the enemy. The language of war reduced to simple imperatives that never captured what it actually meant. Walking through triple canopy jungle where visibility dropped to 20 meters, where every shadow might conceal a spider hole, where the waiting was worse than the fighting because your imagination filled the silence with every way you might die. The first indication that something was wrong came as a sensation rather than a sound, the sudden absence of jungle noise, the constant background chatter of insects and birds cut off like someone had thrown a switch. In that unnatural silence, Jimmy Donovan's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, fingers sliding along the trigger guard. Every Marine in the column felt it simultaneously, the weight of invisible eyes, the prickle of exposed vulnerability. Sergeant Washington raised his fist in the signal to halt, and the platoon froze in a rough line along the trail. Then, the world exploded. The initial burst of fire came from 3 directions simultaneously, a disciplined ambush executed with professional precision. Donovan felt the air crack past his face, heard the distinct snap of rounds breaking the sound barrier inches from his head. The Marine walking point simply collapsed. No dramatic death scene, just there one moment and gone the next. The PRC-25 on Donovan's back transmitted a burst of static as he threw himself sideways into the elephant grass, landing hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. His ears rang with the overlapping staccato of AK-47s, the deeper bass notes of RPD machine guns, the crump of RPG rounds detonating against trees. The smell hit him next, cordite and torn vegetation and something else, something organic and wrong, blood and bowel. Donovan pressed himself flat into the earth, trying to make himself smaller than the space he occupied. Dirt kicked up around him in small fountains as rounds tracked through the elephant grass. He could hear Sergeant Washington screaming orders, "Base of fire left flank, get the 60 up." But the words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the overwhelming sensory assault. He tasted copper in his mouth. Fear or blood, he couldn't tell. His hands moved through trained motions, pulling the handset, keying the transmit button, trying to remember the call signs through the fog of adrenaline. Cyclone 6, Cyclone 6, this is Cyclone 2-1. Contact, heavy contact, grid. The radio exploded. Not metaphorically, an AK round punched through the PRC-25's casing and turned the electronics into sparks and melted plastic. The handset flew from Donovan's grip, trailing a severed cord. Their connection to artillery support, to medevac, to the battalion command post, gone in a fraction of a second. From his position in the command bunker, Captain Min listened to the initial contact reports from his company commanders. The Americans had entered the kill zone exactly as predicted. Now came the critical phase, maintaining fire discipline, preventing his soldiers from expending ammunition too quickly, rotating positions to avoid counter-battery fire when the inevitable American artillery arrived. He watched through binoculars as green tracer rounds, NVA signature, cut through the jungle in controlled bursts. His soldiers were doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. But something was wrong. The Americans weren't breaking. Standard American procedure when ambushed was to assault through the kill zone or fall back to establish a offensive perimeter. These Marines were doing neither. They were holding position and returning fire with a volume and accuracy that spoke to training men respected but hadn't fully anticipated at this intensity. Within minutes of initial contact, the Marines had established a hasty defensive line, identified NVA fighting positions, and begun suppressing them with coordinated fire. The M60 machine gun was up and hammering away at his left flank position. American grenades were arcing into spider holes with uncomfortable precision. Jimmy Donovan rolled behind a fallen log and began taking stock. No radio, no communication with higher command. He could see 4 Marines down, 2 definitely dead, 2 screaming for corpsmen. The jungle canopy was so thick that air support couldn't see through it even if they could call it in. They were cut off, outnumbered, and the NVA fire wasn't slackening. It was intensifying. "Donovan!" Sergeant Washington appeared beside him, face streaked with dirt and someone else's blood. "Radio's dead," Donovan shouted. Washington's expression didn't change. He'd probably assumed as much. "Then we handle this ourselves. Get to Lieutenant Morrison. Tell him we need to flank left. There's a machine gun position chewing us up from that direction." Moving through the killing zone required a specific kind of courage, the willingness to stand up when every instinct screamed to stay down. Donovan low-crawled 15 meters through grass that provided concealment, but no cover whatsoever, feeling rounds snap through the air above him. Lieutenant Morrison was behind a termite mound, firing controlled pairs with his M16. Donovan delivered Washington's message, watched Morrison's eyes calculate odds and options, then nod. "Take 3rd Squad left. I'll suppress with the 60. What happened next wouldn't appear in any tactical manual as a recommended maneuver. It was improvisation born of desperation. One squad providing suppressing fire while another maneuvered through jungle so thick they could barely see 5 meters ahead, trying to flank an enemy position whose exact location they were guessing at based on sound and tracer trajectory. Corporal Davis led 3rd Squad, moving through the undergrowth with his rifle up, every sense straining for the indication of concealed positions. They found the NVA machine gun nest by nearly walking into it. A spider hole dug into the base of a massive hardwood, expertly camouflaged, the RPD's barrel barely visible through the foliage. Davis didn't hesitate. He pulled a grenade, popped a pin, counted 1,000 to 1,000, and threw it in a flat trajectory that put it directly into the hole. The explosion was muffled by earth, but the machine gun stopped firing. 3rd Squad poured fire into the position, then moved forward to clear it. The NVA soldier manning the gun was dead, but his assistant was still alive, badly wounded, looking up at the Marines with eyes that held pain and something else. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The understanding that passed between soldiers on opposite sides who both knew they were instruments of policies made thousands of miles away. A Navy corpsman moved forward to treat him despite the ongoing firefight. That's what corpsmen did. They treated everyone, friend or enemy, because the Hippocratic Oath didn't have exemptions for combat. With the left flank machine gun suppressed, the Marines gained breathing room. Sergeant Washington organized the defensive line, positioned the M60 to cover likely assault routes, and detailed Marines to move the wounded into a rough casualty collection point. Without radio communication, they were fighting blind. No artillery support, no air support, no way to call for medevac or reinforcement. But they were Marines, and the Marine Corps had built its reputation on doing impossible things with insufficient resources. Captain Min realized his ambush was failing. The Americans hadn't broken. They'd adapted. They'd flanked his machine gun position, professional soldiering that he could appreciate even as it complicated his tactical situation. He had two choices: commit his reserve and try to overwhelm the American position through weight of numbers, or break contact and withdraw before American reinforcements arrived with helicopter gunships and artillery. Pride suggested the former. Experience suggested the latter. He gave the order to withdraw by squads, covering each movement with disciplined fire. The firefight lasted another 40 minutes, then gradually diminished as NVA soldiers disengaged and melted back into the jungle. The Marines held their position, expecting a second assault that never came. In the sudden quiet, the cost became visible. 7 Marines dead, 14 wounded, and 1 platoon stranded in hostile territory without communication. Jimmy Donovan sat with his back against a tree, hands shaking with adrenaline come down, staring at the shattered remains of the radio that had been his responsibility. Around him, Marines tended to their wounded, redistributed ammunition, and prepared for whatever came next. 3 kilometers away, at the battalion command post, the sudden loss of radio contact with 2nd Platoon triggered immediate action. In modern military operations, silence from a subordinate unit is never a good sign. It means destruction of communication equipment, death of radio operators, or deliberate enemy jamming, none of which suggest a positive tactical situation. The battalion operations officer immediately diverted a reconnaissance bird to the last known coordinates of 2nd Platoon, while the battalion commander ordered 1st and 3rd Platoons to move toward their sister unit's position. This was the nature of operations in the Arizona Territory. Small unit actions where battalion and regimental commanders could coordinate support but couldn't micromanage tactical decisions. The jungle fragmented forces, limited observation, and turned warfare into a series of isolated engagements where squad leaders made life-and-death decisions that would be evaluated later in after-action reports. The Marines were experienced enough to know that relief would come. The Corps never abandoned its wounded or its dead. But the timeline depended on terrain, enemy activity, and the availability of helicopter assets that were stretched thin across the Corps. For Captain Min, withdrawing from the ambush site represented tactical pragmatism rather than defeat. His battalion had inflicted casualties on the Americans, tested their response capabilities, and gathered intelligence about their operating patterns. The war of attrition favored the side with greater willingness to sustain casualties and more flexible timeline for achieving victory. The Americans were powerful but impatient. The NVA could afford to wait. The sound of rotor blades cutting through jungle air arrived like salvation with wings. The OH-6 Loach reconnaissance helicopter appeared overhead, circling the Marines' position, unable to land in the triple canopy jungle but able to see enough to confirm their location and status. Within minutes, the pilot's report reached Battalion. Second platoon alive but cut off, multiple casualties, requires immediate extraction or reinforcement. What followed was a masterclass in Marine Corps combined arms coordination. The battalion commander made the decision to push reinforcements overland while simultaneously preparing landing zones for medevac helicopters. First platoon, moving at double time through the jungle, reached second platoon's position within 90 minutes. Behind them came M48 Patton tanks, 60 tons of armor that crashed through jungle vegetation like it didn't exist. Their 90mm or main guns and machine guns providing overwhelming firepower that discouraged any NVA consideration of a second engagement. The tanks couldn't navigate the dense jungle forever, but they could create enough of a security perimeter to allow helicopter operations. Combat engineers used chainsaws and demolitions to blow a landing zone large enough for CH-46C Knights to descend through the canopy. The engineers worked under fire, sporadic NVA sniper rounds, and occasional mortar shells. But they worked fast. Speed mattered when Marines were bleeding. Jimmy Donovan watched the medevac birds come in, their crew chiefs manning M60 door guns, corpsmen jumping out before the aircraft fully touched down. The wounded went out first, loaded on stretchers, and carried at a run to the waiting helicopters. The dead went next, wrapped in ponchos because body bags were in short supply. Donovan helped carry Lance Corporal Michaels, who'd been walking point when the ambush began. Michaels' mother would receive a telegram, a folded flag, and a letter from the battalion commander explaining that her son died serving his country. That explanation would have to suffice, because the full truth, that Michaels died in a jungle corridor that the Marines would abandon 2 days later, that no territory was held or gained, was not the kind of truth that fit in condolence letters. With the wounded evacuated and reinforcements in place, 2nd Platoon could finally breathe. They'd survived an ambush designed to destroy them. They'd adapted under fire, maintained unit cohesion, and executed tactical maneuvers that demonstrated training and leadership. The Marine Corps would eventually award Silver Stars and Bronze Stars with V devices for valor demonstrated that morning. Citations would speak of courage under fire and devotion to duty, language that was accurate but insufficient to capture what actually happened when trapped men fought their way through a kill zone. By late afternoon, the Arizona Territory operation continued, but 2nd Platoon had been pulled back to the battalion perimeter for reconstitution. They'd taken 43 Marines into the jungle that morning. They brought back 36. 7 men who'd eaten breakfast, checked their weapons, and walked into the elephant grass would never walk anywhere again. Tactically, the engagement was classified as a successful defense against a planned ambush. 2nd Platoon had identified the ambush, returned fire effectively, flanked enemy positions, held their ground, and withdrew in good order once reinforcements arrived. The NVA battalion withdrew without achieving its objective of destroying the Marine platoon. By the metrics of military success, objectives achieved, casualties inflicted versus casualties sustained, the Marines had won. But winning a tactical engagement and winning a war are different calculations. Captain Min's battalion would regroup, replace casualties with fresh soldiers moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and return to operations in the Arizona Territory. The Marines would conduct more search and destroy operations, inflict more casualties, and clear more territory. Territory that would return to NVA control days after the Marines moved to the next objective. This was the fundamental strategic paradox of the Vietnam War. American forces could win every battle and still not achieve decisive victory because victory required controlling territory and population, not just killing enemy soldiers. On both sides, professional soldiers recognized each other's competence. Captain Min, reviewing the engagement in his after-action assessment, noted that the American platoon had responded with commendable tactical flexibility. He would adjust his ambush techniques based on lessons learned. Lieutenant Morrison, writing his after-action report, noted that the NVA ambush was professionally planned and executed, that enemy fire discipline was excellent, and that withdrawal under fire demonstrated solid training. Neither commander demonized the other. They were professionals evaluating professional performance. The immediate impact of the engagement rippled through the battalion. Units increased their security measures, improved their communication redundancies, and adjusted patrol patterns to avoid predictable routines. The intelligence section updated their assessment of NVA capabilities in the Arizona Territory. The operations section modified their search and destroy plans to account for enemy adaptation. This was the operational feedback loop: contact, analysis, adjustment, next mission. For the Marines of 2nd Platoon, impact was more personal. They'd learned that training works, that leadership matters, that the Marine walking next to you will risk his life for yours. They'd also learned that survival contains substantial elements of luck and chance, that the difference between walking away and being carried out often came down to being in one position rather than another when the first rounds came in. That knowledge would follow them through subsequent patrols, through their remaining months in country, and through the decades afterward. If you've seen this pattern in other battles, share your thoughts in the comments below. Veterans and history enthusiasts, your perspective matters here. 7 Marines died in the ambush. Lance Corporal Thomas Michaels, 19, from Sacramento. Private First Class David Chen, 21, from San Francisco. Lance Corporal Robert Wilson, 20, from Atlanta. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22, from San Antonio. Private First Class William Johnson, 18, from Birmingham. Lance Corporal Kenneth White, 20, from Boston. Private First Class Michael Anderson, 19, from Seattle. Each name represented a family that would receive notification, a funeral with military honors, and a lifetime of wondering what their son or brother or husband might have become if he'd survived March 1968. 14 more Marines were wounded seriously enough to require medevac. Some would recover fully and return to duty. Others would carry physical damage, shrapnel fragments too deep to remove, nerve damage from bullet wounds, blast injuries that would cause pain decades later. All would carry psychological weight that 1968 medical knowledge didn't fully recognize or treat. The term post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't enter psychiatric diagnostic manuals until 1980, but the condition existed regardless of its formal recognition. The NVA casualties were harder to quantify because the enemy carried their dead and wounded when they withdrew. American estimates, based on blood trails and intelligence reports, suggested approximately 30 NVA killed and wounded. Those soldiers had names too, families in villages across North Vietnam who would eventually receive notification through different bureaucratic channels. They'd trained in different camps, motivated by different political rhetoric, but they'd faced the same fears and died in the same jungle as their American counterparts. The battlefield after the shooting stopped looked like every battlefield looks. Torn earth, spent brass casings glinting in filtered sunlight, torn vegetation, bloodstains turning brown in the heat, scattered equipment. The elephant grass where Marines had taken cover was matted down, marked by the passage of bodies moving urgently from position to position. The spider holes that had concealed NVA soldiers were empty now, just holes in the earth that would gradually collapse and disappear. Jimmy Donovan sat in the battalion perimeter that evening, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. The shattered radio lay at his feet. He'd carried the damaged equipment out because you didn't leave gear behind, even destroyed gear. It had stopped a bullet that might have killed him, centimeters different, and his name would have been on the casualty list. That arbitrary nature of survival bothered him more than the combat itself. He'd done everything right, followed all his training, and still his survival came down to angles and timing that had nothing to do with skill or courage. Around him, other Marines dealt with the aftermath in their own ways. Some wrote letters home, some cleaned weapons, some sat in silence, staring at nothing. Sergeant Washington moved through the platoon, checking on his Marines, offering words or silence as each individual needed. Leadership in combat wasn't just about tactical decisions. It was about understanding that men process trauma differently, that some need to talk and others need quiet, that keeping a unit functional after casualties requires attention to psychological factors that wouldn't appear in any field manual. The sun set through jungle canopy, turning the western sky orange and red, colors that in any other context might seem beautiful, but in this context just reminded everyone of fire and blood. Another night in the Arizona Territory. Another day survived. Another morning would bring another patrol, another search and destroy mission, another possibility of contact. This was the rhythm of infantry warfare in Vietnam. Intense violence punctuated by longer periods of tension and boredom, knowing that the next contact could come in 5 minutes or 5 days, but would certainly come eventually. Jimmy Donovan finished his tour in Vietnam in September 1968. He came home to Pittsburgh, married Sarah by the Monongahela River as planned, and tried to resume the life that had been waiting for him. But the person who'd left Pittsburgh 14 months earlier wasn't the same person who returned. The jungle had changed him in ways that civilian life couldn't accommodate. Loud noises made him flinch. Crowded spaces made him anxious. Sleep was difficult because sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant being back in the elephant grass with rounds snapping past his face. He didn't talk about Vietnam, not to Sarah, not to his father who'd fought in Korea, not to the veterans at the VFW Hall. The country was deeply divided over the war by 1968, and veterans returning home faced hostility from anti-war protesters and indifference from a public that was tired of hearing about a conflict that seemed to have no resolution. Donovan went to work at the steel mill, raised 2 daughters, and carried Vietnam as a private burden for decades. What happened in the Arizona Territory wasn't his fault. The tactical decisions that sent 2nd Platoon into a planned ambush were made at higher command levels. The strategic decisions that put American forces in Vietnam in the first place were made in Washington by politicians and policymakers who believed in domino theories and Cold War imperatives. The Marines who walked into that jungle were implementing decisions they didn't make, fighting a war whose objectives were never clearly defined, serving their country because they believed service mattered. They served honorably. They demonstrated courage, skill, and devotion to each other under conditions that would have broken lesser units. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, not in the men who executed those strategies with professional competence. 2nd Platoon did everything that was asked of them. They held their ground under fire, adapted to tactical situations, cared for their wounded, and brought their dead home. That their tactical success didn't translate to strategic victory was not a failure of their service, but a failure of the war's fundamental premise. Captain Min survived the war and remained in the People's Army of Vietnam until his retirement in the 1980s. He'd spent nearly his entire adult life in uniform, fighting first against the French, then against the Americans, finally against Chinese forces in the brief 1979 border war. Looking back decades later, he could acknowledge professional respect for American military capabilities while maintaining that his cause was legitimate resistance against foreign intervention. Warriors on both sides could hold those truths simultaneously without contradiction, that they fought with courage and skill, that their opponents fought with courage and skill, and that the larger question of whether the wars themselves were justified remained separate from individual service. War creates heroes and tragedies on all sides. It demands sacrifice and offers trauma. The men who fought in the Arizona Territory, American and Vietnamese, weren't villains or saints. They were soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders, protecting their comrades, trying to survive impossible situations. Decades later, some of those veterans have met, connected through battlefield tourism that allows former enemies to stand together at sites where they once tried to kill each other. Those meetings offer a kind of reconciliation, an acknowledgement that courage and honor aren't exclusive to one side. Jimmy Donovan kept that shattered radio in his garage for 40 years, a piece of destroyed equipment that somehow meant more than all his medals. It represented the moment when everything changed, when training became reality, when abstract concepts of courage became concrete decisions made under fire. He never glorified what happened that morning in March 1968, but he never dismissed it either. It mattered. The service mattered. The sacrifice of the men who didn't come home mattered. And the lesson, that tactical success doesn't equal strategic victory, that wars should have clear objectives and achievable outcomes, matters still. These stories survive because people refuse to forget. Because veterans and their families and historians and anyone who believes that sacrifice deserves remembrance choose to keep them alive. If you've made it this far, you understand why that matters. Subscribe and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes. The men who fought deserve that much. The men who died deserve that much. And the generations that follow deserve to understand what was asked of them, what they gave, and what it cost.